I think we have to stay with the gap or the crack in being. Stay with it. Don't try to cover it over. Don't try to paper it over. Religions have tried to paper it over. Capitalism has tried to paper it over. But both of the papering over of the gap or the crack in being is where you find self-actualization. You find your future project in fidelity to the gap or crack in being because you're actually serving the reel of history. You can only find your future project if you're staying with what's missing, if you're staying with what's lacking, and you develop that. Every beginning starts with a lack. Every beginning starts with something missing. And you stay with that, there's a certain pain in that. But if you stay with that, I think that's where there's a real generative project can emerge. And I think staying with this gap, staying with this crack, this is also the guarantee to be non-deterministic. This is also the guarantee to be non-computational. Why? Because what is the gap or the crack? I think it's just our freedom. And I think it's there that we have the space to overcome any of these fantasies of AI as some sort of apocalyptic end of the human being. I think AI is going to computationally or deterministically transform the world, but it's not going to cover over this gap. It's yet another, if we have religion, if we have capitalism, if we have technology trying to cover over the gap or the crack. I think that the gift that we have at this moment is that we can discover on a deeper level what is the nature of subjectivity. And I think that's what has motivated the history of modern philosophy. I think it's motivated a lot of the history of psychoanalysis. And I think it should be motivating us when we're building these future networks to be really interested and intrigued about what does it mean today to be free.
Welcome to the 18th episode of Humans on the Loop. I'm your host, Michael Garfield, and this week's guest is Cadell Last, the creator of Philosophy Portal, author of Global Brain Singularity and Real Speculations, organizer of myriad conferences, anthologies, and collaborative volumes exploring biocultural evolution, mind-matter relations, and speculative futures. Cadell has been the director of psychedelic research at Serenity, a researcher at the Bertalanffy Center for the Study of Systems Science, a science writer on primatology and paleoanthropology for Scientific American, and the founder, writer, and researcher for the Advanced Apes at PBS Digital Studios. He is someone I can always count on to inspire me to think deeply and act wisely. This conversation was very overdue, and I'm grateful to finally fold him into this program's ongoing weave of perspectives. In this episode, we discuss self-actualization and self-transformation in our age of magical technologies, the domestication of the human being by AI and institutions, how to live in a future of hypersocial neuroplasticity, navigating hybrid physical-virtual relationships, the importance of intergenerational learning, and how we can make a better argument for culture to the social systems that only perceive measurable value. In the climax of our dialogue, Cadell makes a case for staying with the lack and working the cracks in being as ways of cultivating our agency in a highly automated world. If you enjoy this conversation, consider becoming a supporter. This show is just a small part of the mostly unpaid work I'm doing to foster public discourse on wise innovation and help to integrate the psychedelic experience of advanced computing, including regular hangouts and study groups, and the wonderful online commons we have growing in the Wisdom and Technology Discord server, as well as more illegible but highly generative community work than I can mention here. The two latest essays to interrupt my regular podcast schedule, What is Being More Than a Machine and Why Should I Contain Multitudes?, are now both up on Substack, where I'm having a ton of fun on social media for the first time in a long time. And I promise more soon because I'm bursting with ideas to share from the dozens of unpublished episodes in the Humans on the Loop editing queue. Subscribe if you want to stay up on where I was with this research 6 months ago, and become a patron if you want to be in on where it's taking me now. Big thanks to everyone staking in on independent research, including our new member Oyston K, and the excellent student cohort in my running Weirdosphere course on how to live in the future. Join our next community call on May 31st and scope the superb discussion we just had on Federico Campagna's prophetic culture by signing up at humansontheloop.com. There you'll also find links to all of Cadell's research papers, books, videos, and courses, an investment well worth making in your own open-ended becoming. And with that, thank you for listening and enjoy. Yeah, Cadell, you're on the loop. You asked just a moment ago for a little more framing on this project. I guess this project is a way of not only helping provide people with what I consider to be a useful conceptual framework for better imagination and better attention allocation in the age of generative AI, but can help people think about how to structure their own knowledge and to foster their own relationships, and is somewhat self-undermining in the way that a good teacher obsolesces themselves. It is intended to lead to people finding each other, sifting themselves out together into working groups and projects in the umbra of the artifacts made by this. And generally, I think it comes out of and is still profoundly motivated by a desire to get people out of this position of alienation and disenfranchisement as end users of technologies that other people have made. So I think it'll be clear to you how the thoughts that you've had about a decentralized singularity and about the changing nature of the human as we become more deliberately co-participatory within a global brain, etc., all fit into this big thing that you and I have been dancing around together, but somewhat down the beach from one another now for over a decade. So anyway, hello.
I
All right. Yeah. So I
That's such a weird co-parallel evolution that we've had, I think.
totally. So, I mean, I guess where I would like to start is just the seemingly mundane ritual of telling people like who you are, where you come from, why you
Sure.
started getting interested in this stuff, how you're exploring it now, and then we can use some of your papers as anchor points as we enter into a more structured examination of this stuff.
Sure, I just wanna say first that I'm totally on board, and I think it's absolutely important to have this idea that the teacher is a kind of vanishing mediator as opposed to a permanent point of reference. And I think that is a hallmark of good teaching. And I think that is both healthy for the student and the teacher, actually. I don't think it's actually healthy for a teacher to hold themselves as a permanent point of self reference. I think that's a deeper, maybe reflection on their own unconscious there. And I think that there's huge opportunities here if we can develop a deeper self relation to our own attention and our own awareness. Of course, huge powers to cultivate a new world, but also huge threats at the same time. I'm reminded of what one of the technological singularity theorists, Peter Diamandis, said that one person now can create what an institution used to create. And that gives us this opening into a move from institutional life to a more network life. But what type of subjectivity is required for this transformation from, let's say, institutions to networks, and how to think through this together? So, just very quickly, who am I? I basically tell my story as someone who, in the time of 18 or 19, for whatever reason, started to engage in an intellectual investigation based on the just basically mystery and wonder about the human condition. I basically had the presupposition that human beings are different from everything else in the universe, and followed that intuition. And that first led me to an investigation of the difference between humans and great apes. But secondarily, that led me into the the consequences of that difference, basically, the consequences of our language, our technology, our self-consciousness, and being interested in what all of those dimensions of our uniqueness meant for the human future. And that, long story short, led me to do a doctorate on the global brain singularity, which was basically trying to develop an anthropological theory of evolution in relationship to ideas about the technological singularity. And I think why that's a novel contribution to science and a novel contribution to philosophy is that our starting point, our ground presupposition in evolutionary theory is actually usually starting in biology and starting in, of course, Darwinian evolutionary thinking. But I think that what this starting point misses is, again, the uniqueness of the human being and the possibility that what the human being is actually a collision point between two different forms of evolutionary process, and understanding actually the dynamics of these evolutionary processes. Of course, on the one hand, you've got the biochemical, but on the other hand, I think you've got the techno-cultural. And I think that the meeting point of these two evolutions is producing something bizarre and disorienting. And so that's been my motivating drive.
So one of the papers I pulled off your Google Scholar touches on this shift from, like, when I think about this, I think in terms of the individual as process of mutual information exchange with the environment, either through descent and through inheritance in time, this gradient between systems like an eddy in a creek that has no DNA and is entirely scaffolded by the structural relationships between water and the creek bed, and then the sort of more classically defined self-contained individual that's primarily defined by the inheritance of information. I find it really useful to think about that when I part out the three layers of automation that people are talking about in, like, weapon systems. Human out of the loop, where there's no decision making, is on the whirlpool end of that spectrum, and human in the loop, where the person is actually authoring a decision, is on that sense of being the sort of agent of one's own destiny. This whole project is spec'd on both of those extremes being rare, if at all even existent. When you're looking at the way that all of us are kind of shaped by both nature and culture, to the extent that we can even talk about those as distinct. So you've got this paper, Human Evolution, Life History Theory and the End of Biological Reproduction, where I want to start, because looking at our relationship to other primates and how we have lifelong neuroplasticity and encephalization and hypersocialization and delayed age of reproduction, there's a sense in which we can talk about becoming more and more co-determined by culture, which includes the built environment and Kevin Kelly's technium and all this stuff, that this is, like, our institutions are part of the way that we are domesticated by the emerging global superorganism, and that there's, like, you cast forward into a vision of the future in which basically culture has overtaken biology in this sort of Darwinian sense. This is really important for at least two pillars of this project. One being thinking about technology as a form of parenting, where it's like what it means to take responsibility for one's biological offspring, but also we don't get to predetermine the destiny or the personality of these things, like a smartphone or a wheel even. And then the other is this sort of gaming and addiction, in the way that you can think about the relationship between the hedonic imperative and human reproduction, and how we're like, it's like a weird, tragic joke that a lot of people are experiencing this, being in bed with your partner, both glued to your phones, instead of actually just making love. Yeah, there's just like a huge yarn ball of stuff there that I would love for you to talk a little bit more about your thinking on this paper and then how it relates to the continued process of our domestication and then what it means to be responsible in this space when we are like colonial organisms and our agency has to be recast in light of all of this. You can go for like half an hour.
Yeah, yo, it's a lot. It's a lot, but I can play with this. There's a lot to play with. And let's just bring it to our own self relation to basically our own path and maybe each other as well. That I see, at least I'll speak for myself, what I'm doing as primarily caught up into a drive of cultural reproduction in the sense that I place an inordinate amount of time and attention into cultural reproduction, whether that's the creation of my different philosophical works or books or podcasts or whatever it is that I find culturally and creatively drawn to. A lot of my time, attention, and identity is put into this drive. Consequently, there's a type of feedback loop that opens up there that actually generates a lot of meaning and new forms of relationality from this drive. And I'm not sure if you've experienced the same thing. I know you're also a father, but as being a father, I think you've also expressed in various sort of social media posts this intense tension and antagonism between the amount of time and energy it takes to both be a full-time creative cultural reproducer on the one hand and a biological reproducer on the other hand, and to do both of those things well. And I think that's really the major challenge for what you were talking about in regards to, let's say, post-industrial adult in the developed world today, is that how do we do both of these well? And I think that what we can take as a starting point here for reflection, or at least what I take as a starting point here for reflection, is that no human beings in the past have been able to solve this riddle, because human beings in the past were primarily caught up in the biological reproduction loop. The reproduction rates, the number of children that people were having, as well as the times at which people were having children, was much earlier, and of course, many more offspring. And at the same time, I think there were less avenues for cultural creativity and cultural expression. And so, in some ways, this tension and antagonism, which I'm taking in my work to be central, is really the challenge of, I think, our generation. And I think the more conversations we have about this, and maybe even the more robust and reflective networks that we have to take this challenge on board and actively work through this challenge as a community or as a distributed network, I think the better. And I think that this is going to become the central issue for young people coming up now. Young people coming up now, they do complain about a meaning crisis. There are data on sexlessness and young people just being disinterested in sex, which is, of course, very strange, probably for both you and I to think back on being 18 or 19. Certainly for me, being attracted and being attractive was incredibly important. So it does beg the question, what's going on? And I think that this theory that I developed, actually one of the first papers I published, is related to cultural reproduction in some sort of antagonistic relationship with biological reproduction, but that this has gone overlooked, that we're not that reflective about this tension and how potentially crazy the consequences of this tension are. Because what it means ultimately is that our being is being decoupled in some way from the meaning systems that were related to biological reproduction. Because where did the meaning really come from in the past? Of course, it was secondarily the religions and the metaphysical structures, but it was also the actual being embedded and embodied in the reproduction process, which just gives you the meaning, because just being a father or just being a mother is already a full-time job. And it's an incredibly meaningful job, and it's self-evident that it's meaningful. So all of that is, I think, what is really at the core of this meaning crisis. I think it could also be connected to the fact of another idea that I develop in Global Brain Singularity, which is the metasystem transition, which is that our institutions from the industrial era are absolutely being undermined and transformed, and something new, I think, could appear, or something new is appearing. And perhaps you and I are both participating in this new appearing and also the collapse of the old system. It's still very early, and I think it's still very in its seed forms. And I think our projects are probably the seeds themselves of what might be the new networks, how we relate to each other, and how we build lifelong projects that are able to stabilize meaning on both, hopefully, the biological and the cultural level. But this is something that for me, I approach as a scientific and a philosophical mystery, is what is the future of these evolutionary processes? I think it's really an open-ended question, and I try to approach this with the mind of a curiosity in terms of the strangeness of our moment.
Yeah, so I haven't published this yet, but for the last several years, I've been collecting notes on this trend in our lineage, anyway, of paedomorphosis, that the first vertebrates were basically the sexually mature larvae of these organisms that started out swimming through the water column and eventually settled onto rocks and became filter feeders. And we still see these, the sea squirts and so on. And again, it looks like when we trend towards socialization and we trend toward interdependence with other organisms of our type, schooling fish conferred advantages, for example, predator evasion, that like a tunicate does not have by being a sessile filter feeding organism. They're able to actively seek out food as well as to escape from predators. And we can see a similar kind of thing again and again and again as our environments become more complex and we become more entangled with one another in the matrix of our sociality, which has, like you said, in a sense, we're getting simpler because the locus of agency is moving toward the group, the emergence of a meta individual. In another sense, there's a pressure on the individual as originally prescribed to become more and more intelligent as it has to navigate spaces of greater dimensionality. So, like the sea squirt doesn't lose its head, it develops a more and more complex brain as the environment of the school requires more nimble and agile relationship to the other fish. And so there's this sense in which Lawrence Steinberg has said continued exposure to novelty keeps the brain plastic for longer. There's a shift in education to open-ended problem solving and play and metacognition. Like you said in this paper, that simply having a job in this world is increasingly dependent on the acquisition of advanced degrees, the length of schooling. And you can see this sort of when humans and wolves domesticated each other. Wolves don't have obedience school. So I don't know. This is just another bouquet of stuff that I'd love to hear you riff on this in relationship specifically to the way that it's not just that cultural information production and transmission is taking over. It is also the fact that our understanding of biology is becoming more and more digitized, and we're making more and more sophisticated models of the person in computer simulation. And if you listen to effective accelerationists and singularitarians, they talk about a sort of complete handover where we still have people, but they've become digital objects. At that point, there's a sort of a paradox where the convergence of digitally augmented life extension research and high fidelity reproduction of human beings through digital mechanisms leads us to not immortality of the biological organism, but a phase transition where we become constantly hyper adaptive to the environment in a phase that is obedient to the demands of an extremely rapid innovation landscape and like pressures on us to stay young and playful and cute as a means of being like interoperable with one another and with the pressures of hypersocialization and so on. That, yeah, that's bonkers, but I swear to God that I'm trying to get us to a point where we can make some really simple and concrete and pragmatic statements about what it means to practice agency in these kinds of advanced technological landscapes.
It's a huge challenge, and I think we are all in over our heads. And I think that's one of the defining features of this move of what type of subjectivity is going to be required to move from this institutional identity on the one hand to a networked identity on the other hand. I think that it's the type of human being that can get comfortable with being overwhelmed, and the type of human that can be comfortable with having the situation be, as it were, metaphorically over our head, as opposed to neatly contained in our head. And this takes a much deeper engagement with, I think, our emotional, spiritual process. Take, for example, what you were saying about being transformed into digital objects. I was just discovering last week on this website called Perplexity, which I'm sure you're aware of, that it does a pretty good job of reproducing my digital identity. If I just put in what is global brain singularity or what are the courses at Philosophy Portal, Perplexity like basically gives you really good answers. So in some sense, I'm already being like mapped by AI as a digital object. And in regards to this point you made about biology becoming digitized, that's kind of part of what I'm trying to say with the biochemical evolution and what I would call technocultural evolution, because biology becoming digitized is biology being taken up into the technocultural. And I think that here, this idea of becoming a digital object, I'll just be frank, many of my collaborators, many of my friends, many of my creative networks were basically digital objects to each other in a way. We have to go out of our way to not just be digital objects to each other. And I think I'll get to that in a moment, because I think that's actually an important key, is how can we at the one time accept the reality of being turned into digital objects for each other, and at the other hand, trying to make space for this tension between the actual biological evolutionary process and the cultural evolutionary process. And I think those are where the stakes are in terms of our actual life process, you and I. But in regards to this type of accelerationism that you were pointing towards, I think this is really where I situate the metasystem transition on the highest level to technocultural evolution. How to interpret this? You have philosophers like Nick Land who are saying, for example, that we are imminently going to become techno sapiens, and that any sort of clinging to the biological, any clinging to, he says, nature or socially literate culture or modes of theological sentimentalities is a infantile resistance to the emergence of future techno sapiens. And I think that here, this is like a really important philosophical challenge. Okay, on the one hand, this seems imminent, but on the other hand, is it really so simple? Is it really just this linear process towards the techno sapiens, or is there a different interpretation here? And where I start is actually where you started with the notion of bounds or boundary, which is that, at least in my exploration of the technological singularity theory literature, I think the concepts that are overlooked here are things like constraint, things like limit, and things like boundary. So when we take into consideration constraint, limit, and boundary, I think that we overcome this tendency in technological singularity thinking towards going towards some infinite thing, overcoming every limit, overcoming every boundary, overcoming every possible limitation on my being into the infinite thing. And I think that we can actually start thinking about a new social life is basically creating new limits, creating new constraints, creating new boundaries. And I think here the central challenge and the paradox of our sociality, if I could call it that, is that technology is creating for us both a strange social closeness and a strange social distance. Now, I think the closeness is actually a disembodied sociality. Like, you and I are closer than we could ever be in the past, but it's in a disembodied form. Now, there's more distance between us physically, though. Like, in terms of my day-to-day physical life, I actually don't need to interact with hardly any human beings. I can even go to the grocery store and everything's automated already. You can go to the automated checkouts or whatever. You don't need to even go to the movie theater anymore because everything's better on Netflix anyway. So I'm just saying here that there is technologies creating the conditions of possibility for this immense social distance and this what people call atomization, or this hyper individuation. But on the other hand, the paradox is that it creates a hyper closeness. If I really pay attention to all of my links and networks on let's say the level of the internet, We are so close to each other, and our networks are so interestingly overlapping with each other. It's mind-boggling, and it's infinitely fascinating to me. And this does demand a new type of reflective engagement with sociality. It's a super strange challenge. But then I'll really finish here by saying that the ultimate challenge in terms of what I'm trying to do in my work is what I call the virtual physical loop. And now this could be some interesting connection with your project, Humans on the Loop, because the virtual physical loop is basically saying, okay, we are collaborating and coordinating with each other as virtual digital objects, basically. And there's a huge creative power there. I don't think we should just dismiss it. I think it's something that is tremendously powerful. But at the same time, I think that we learn something extremely important by taking the time to really think through those limits, to really think through those boundaries, and to really think through those constraints in terms of physically organizing events and retreats and different types of workshops with each other, to really think, what is the meaning and what is the purpose of coming together physically? Why is that necessary? Why can't we lose that? Because I don't think we can. I think that we're massively strengthened, and I think my network is massively strengthened by taking that extra step.
Yeah, so just to embellish this a little bit, I want to plug this into another working paper that you wrote, Self-Actualization in the Commons. This is a piece in which a lot of what you're talking about comes into focus, this paradoxical relationship between distance and closeness, or between our mediation through technology and our shared interdependence on those technologies, or the decontextualization of information and relationships affected by that superstructure, the way that, for instance, English as a universal language for science or decimal based mathematics systems extract things out of what Nora Bateson calls the warm data of lived experience and into models that are then acted on, that then constrain our behavior, that as the way that Jessica Flack talks about coarse graining as downward causation, that like the models that we create, not just about each other, but about ourselves, then lead to this weird thing where each of us, in some respect, has more of a social contract with the shared modeling space than we do with directly with one another. And so through our shared abstractions and through our embeddedness in and definition by the hyperobjects of the internet, obviously, but the internet being just the latest layer of something that existed already in the form of markets and nation states and so on. In this piece, you're exploring what it means to self-actualized and how you cannot be self-actualized without being inside of a network. And this show is predicated on the notion that a lot of people are focusing on the product that their organization produces without recognizing that the product emerges within a prior atmosphere of conversation and shared understanding, and that you can't just write scientific papers or new software or whatever and then push it out into the world and expect it to live on its own. I would love to hear you talk more about the way that we're going to be able to claw the commons back out of its enclosure by economies of scale and the condensation of wealth and power that kind of dynamic has afforded. And you make a distinction here between automated commons and collaborative commons that I guess maybe we can loosely analogize as illegible ecosystem services upon which innovation depends, and then also maybe the narratives, the religious value systems, etc., that harmonize our behavior toward common objectives. If I'm understanding you right. And then in light of all of this, a part of this is a networked permeable self-actualizing in networked and permeable institutions is currently bumping up violently against this sort of exist in order to exist tendency for bureaucracies, including the sort of myth of a continuous egoic identity. at the level of the human, at the level of the nation state, at the level of whatever religious narrative. What you talk about also in a number of other pieces, that there are prescriptive and predictive statements that you make about how governance at multiple scales and religion in a very broadly defined sense are going to have to look in order to actually function as the vehicles for self-actualization in a highly automated planet scale operation.
Yeah, so there's again a lot there. I think in the actual paper I developed from the original ideas about the self-actualization in the commons was a paper called Global Commons and the Global Brain. And basically what I'm trying to work out there is, what is our political response to the coming wave of technological automation? And going through the different options in terms of the main ones I could think in terms of what I think our current political, say, predisposition is a type of neoliberalism, a type of international open market dynamic. I think that there are other people like Thomas Piketty who are proposing a type of global state Keynesianism, where we take the Keynesian policies from the early 20th century and we apply them on the scale of the global metasystem transition. And there, I think we get into questions about the actual qualitative transition. Do solutions from the 20th century that were applied to the nation state model actually work on the level of the global state model? Or is that language even itself wrong? And ultimately coming to the idea, which I think is shared by many other thinkers, like the first person that's coming to my mind is the work of Michel Bowens, which is the idea that the commons is actually needed as a third category, that if we continue to think within the state and the market, and if we don't think the nature of the commons, that we are politically going to be shooting ourselves theoretically in the foot, because the market and the state are broken by whatever's coming with these waves of technological automation. And I do think that distinction between automated commons and collaborative commons really can help us think through new network dynamics. And ultimately, I think that our intellectual, artistic, creative projects are on the line in really thinking with these processes as opposed to against these processes. And I think you made that point really well by saying that you cannot just write papers or write software as standalone creative entities and expect them to live on their own. I learned that kind of the hard way in terms of releasing my book, Global Brain Singularity, at the same time as leaving the institutional network within which I published Global Brain Singularity, and only met the void, really. The book just doesn't do anything on its own. And then learning from that process, basically starting to create my work much more organically and dynamically in network context, and recognizing that books and courses and anything that I create is really only as valuable as the network I'm participating in. And I think what we haven't thought through enough, but which I'm glad you brought to the center of the conversation, is this idea that, let's say, as digital objects, we have a lot of stakes. And I think right now it's unconscious, but we have a lot of stakes in the shared modeling process. And again, the networks that are overlapping with each other, they're a lot closer and a lot more interconnected than we think. This shared modeling process is already well underway, and I do think that there is community, let's say, I would say community, plural, identities that are emerging. And I think that we, at least for me, I don't think we should think about it as one community. It could be one network, but it's going to be a one network with many communities and many different visions. And the question really becomes, do we have the shamanic subjectivity that can help navigate between the different communities and the different tribes and their different modeling processes? Because we can feel a sense of belonging and we can feel a sense of home within our sort of shared modeling community, but we can feel a sense of antagonism, we can feel a sense of tension with other communities. And it does take the shaman, which is a kind of in-between character. And I've talked about this a lot with Layman Pascal at the integral stage. And I really think Layman Pascal is also someone who's a kind of shamanic intelligence and is really moving between different tribes and trying to find that right balance between grounding a belonging in one tribe and finding the space to navigate between different tribes. And I think that's an art and a skill all of its own, but that's the human skill we need if we're not going to just treat each other as digital objects and if we're going to come into the loop, so to speak.
Yeah. I guess this is where we can really bite down on the central question that I have for you, which is it seems like people recognize that the commons or the work of cultural creation or art and philosophy as a way of producing the ways of seeing that allow us to adapt to novel conditions. This is all incredibly important. And yet, having to render everything into the language that makes it legible to and operable on by markets is like you've lost the fight before you've even started. And so everybody I talked to, I was just talking to David J recently. David was part of the Center for Humane Technology and just wrote a book on relationality and is working with people inside organizations and in the US Senate and elsewhere to help make the kind of the networking that people do inside of organizations more visible to and appreciated by the leadership of those organizations. But like you run the risk in doing that of creating proxy metrics that then end up distorting the behavior and forcing it into subservience to quantitative measurement, which gets you back to the beginning of the problem, right? So there's this sense of like complex life on Earth would not exist if we did not have an increase in atmospheric oxygen, which enabled the diffusion of oxygen into organisms that were made of more layers of cells, right? But like oxygen starts off as a waste product that nothing knows how to metabolize. Or Philip K. Dick famously wrote that the symbols of the divine emerge in the trash stratum. So, my question for you in thinking about how to actually foster a commons where we've got space for that third pole in the triangle is something like how do we come to love waste or noise or inefficiency? How do we actually make time in our lives, not just to accelerate, but to steer? How do we make relationality and activities of intrinsic value more of a concrete and explicit value and virtue in society without bending them to the instrumentalization of the other's dominant systems?
Yeah, so for me, I want to get to your question. I want to start though by saying that we aren't going to solve this problem through a liberal notion of institutional recognition. You already pointed at that yourself, but I think that's a trap. And I don't think that's really going to, at the end of the day, do the work we need to actually get us to a different system. Basically, I'm still working with a model that I would call Marxist in a way. I'm certainly not a orthodox Marxist, but I just find the dialectical structure useful for thinking, specifically between the dimensions of slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and communism, and specifically thinking through that as a dialectical matrix, because I think that where we are right now, I don't know if you've read the work of Yanis Varoufakis, but the idea of techno-feudalism is, I think, a very powerful one. And I know there are people, detractors, and there are people who argue against that notion. But at the same time, I think it's a very powerful notion, and I see it catching on. That it at least convincing to me that what we're living in right now is not so much techno capitalism, but techno feudalism. And that suggests that because when we were growing up, there was a coherent political direction towards democratic socialism, and there was the idea among millennials that democratic socialism could be a viable pathway forward. And I think that sort of reached its climax with both the disappointment of the Obama regime and also the failure of the Sanders campaign. But ultimately, with the collapse of those projects, I think following here the work of Marxist theorist Chris Catrone, I think we are living through what he calls the death of the millennial left. And with that death of the millennial left comes a big question about how do we really move forward. And for me at Philosophy Portal, I'm going back to the philosophical drawing board of those early writings of the Hegels and the Marxes and the German idealists, where these ideas about left and right and the ideas about socialism and the liberal state really came into their early formation. And I think that philosophical work is at the moment underrated because it's absolutely at the core of many of the challenges that we face politically and economically. But just here to go deeper, I think when you see, for example, the Twitter feed of someone like Andrew Tate is basically not only embracing techno-feudalism, but he's saying that if you do not follow him into a feudal type structure, that you will become a slave to what he calls the matrix. And so this idea that feudalism and slavery are the territory we're wandering into, if we don't think of a coherent way forward to some type of democratic socialism, if that's the right word, or some sort of new form of socialism, that is a real threat. So let me bring that more closer to myself, because I became very disenchanted and became very disengaged from mainstream politics back in 2016. And I think that was actually the right move. But I've internalized these structures into myself and tried to work through them on a lower scale local level, which is basically I came to the decision in 2017 that I cannot foreclose the reality of capitalism, meaning that I have to work through capitalism and that's just the reality I'm in, or that's the presupposition and what I mean by that, I'm not identifying with capitalism as an end goal, certainly not, but I'm not foreclosing it as part of my process. And I'm not foreclosing it as a necessary part of the process to hopefully get towards a more socialist reality. But basically, what I do there is I introduce capitalism in terms of its limits and constraints on my behavior and my activity, and try to use those and harness those, as difficult as it is and as unpleasurable as it is, quite frankly, to open up spaces that I would call socialist spaces. And I could get more concrete with what I mean by that, and I could give you concrete examples of what I call socialist spaces. But the point there is that the end goal of my capitalist activity is socialist. And so I'm trying to build in the dialectic into my life. So basically, I'm using the profits that I can accumulate through my capitalist activity towards building more social spaces. And then my thinking is that if I can collaborate with enough other people who are in a similar age range and in a similar business construction phase as myself, that we can collaborate and build even greater socialist spaces. And so basically building from the bottom up, because here, following the work of political scientist Benjamin Studebaker, I agree with his analysis of American politics that the quote unquote way is shut, meaning democracy, the way through the state at the moment is shut. And so collaborating or building a movement on the level of an Occupy Wall Street or a Bernie Sanders campaign is not necessarily the way forward at the moment. It's much more, I see the emancipatory potential in these networks that we're both participating in, but in these networks stewarded by people who are basically working the dialectic of capitalism and socialism. And I think that here we get to the key question to me, which is how do we decelerate? And I think you asked that. We got accelerationism on the one hand, then you got the question, how do we decelerate? And I think that's back to what I was saying earlier. We have to introduce limits, constraints, and boundaries in order to decelerate. And now here's the deeper question. What are those limits, constraints, and boundaries? And I think those limits, constraints, and boundaries have to be thought on the level of both capitalism and socialism in a dialectic with each other, which is that there's a few things here. Let me point first to the socialist dimension, that I think our relation should be in a physical virtual loop, that we're thinking in terms of years. We're thinking in terms of building physical ritual space with each other. And this is not one community. This is a multi-tribal, multi-communal vision here. The physical virtual loop. Intergenerational relationships are absolutely key. If we do not get intergenerational relationships right, we are effed. Here I'm talking about, and here as a father, yourself as it starts to me with father and son, mother and daughter, elder and child. It starts with that, and teacher and student. And again, thinking about these terms as vanishing mediator. The father is a vanishing mediator. The teacher is a vanishing mediator. What is it a vanishing mediator for? It's for independence and freedom of that person to build and participate in the networks on their own choice and on their own decision making. And then finally, long-term relationality and also sexual difference. Long-term relationality on the level of sexual difference, to me, is the absolute center of our limits and our constraints. I don't want to judge here. I'm not moral about it, and I don't moralize about it. But at the same time, when I look at the people who I'm closest to in terms of my collaborations, the people who I'm closest to in terms of my long-term collaborations are all recognizing the importance of the limits and the constraints on sexual difference. And that is absolutely key to deceleration. I could go on further, but that's a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about this specifically in the context of the new structures of religion. There is a fundamental argument that you can make if you want to reduce the hierarchy of needs to something like survival, success, and significance, that people tend to regard these as separate. And this is basically what you're saying in your work on the commons. Like, I was watching Gordon Brander this morning comparing the invention of the wheel to the invention of language models, and saying that if Twitter existed during the invention of the wheel, this is like hilarious commentary on how people would have said, oh, but we already walk around. What's the point? And in that discussion, I didn't see anybody really pointing to the fact that the increase in speed or the qualitative difference in human life afforded by the wheel also depends on roads, and that roads depend on, well, at least historically, civilization is more or less synonymous with like taxation. And so, similarly, I feel like to the extent that I have tried to use the machinery of capitalism to get myself into something that looks like a more socialist lifestyle, I found myself trying to make an argument to organizations and individuals of means that you can't actually survive or succeed without folding the process of sense making or of philosophical activity or of the creation of intersubjective space for the coordination of behavior in acts of the production or the realization of significance. And that, so that like this notion of like productivity as the means rather than an end, the end being a more complete instantiation or exfoliation of what it means to be a human, the idea that like festivals exist not simply to relieve pressure from an oppressive control structure, but like bacchanalia is an end unto itself, that ecstasis is fun, that liberation from self definition is actually the goal of the production of abundance through technological means, that festivals are not a vehicle for profit, but are a celebration of excess. And then, likewise, to the extent that our increasing dependence on opaque systems of statistical correlation brings us back to a realization that, like, we actually only ever understand things in retrospect, that science wouldn't actually function if we demanded that we would have a mechanism in place before we investigated anomalous evidence, that there's hope in the notion that a lot of the world that we're looking at now came out of an increased tolerance or slack or accommodation of weirdness and mystery in wartime research and design. Like, people like Alan Turing were accepted for as long as they were useful, and we don't have to understand, we just have to know that it works. I feel like I'm just betraying the fact that I'm still not fully decolonized here in my thinking. But as somebody who is trying to find better and better ways to describe the significance and the value of this work to people who only have 23 seconds to listen to your pitch, how do you think about the thin end of the wedge when it comes to recognizing the resurgence of ritual and play and religious activity in a society that is like pathologically fixated on practicality and on legible value?
Okay, so what I sense as the underlying tension and current in your reflection there, and it's something I'm sympathetic with, and it's something I struggle with as well, is basically finding funding from the old system. And how do we cultivate the attractive basins of investment? And why has investment dried up? Look, the simple fact is, I think that the techno capitalists and the older generation are not funding and not investing in the next generation and it's creating a fundamental tension between the generations. And it's hard not to enter into the mode of scapegoating. At the same time, I think we have to, at least I'll speak for myself, we have to take that frustration, we have to take that anger, we have to take that aggression that we may want to direct externally to the social conditions which are economically abhorrent. And we have to learn to build with less. And we have to learn how to value relations internal to the networks that we're building more than constantly looking for the guy who has 23 seconds to listen to our pitch. And I think that's at least the path I'm taking now. It's not if someone calls me and has an investment opportunity that I won't take advantage of that, or I won't try to learn better how to navigate and communicate with such individuals. But I don't know if that is the most open way forward. Again, I would cite Benjamin Studebaker's work on The Way is Shut. If it on the higher levels of social organization, it does look like the way is shut at the moment. And I don't know if that's going to change, but if I could source a important principle that is important to take forward with us in these conditions, it's that death is fundamentally linked to what I think the next ethic should be. And what I mean by that is that the older generation, and here I'm talking about the boomer generation and even Generation X or whatever, they do not have an ethics that's connected to death at all. And they basically act as if they're going to live forever, and they act as if the next generation doesn't matter and that they don't have to invest in the next generation. And I think that's basically the conditions we're existing in at the moment. So I just think that the importance of, I always had the saying of die again, die better, which is that actually connecting to death is ethically important and actually can help us make forward advances towards this network identity, which can do more with less, I guess, to use I think it's the Buckminster Fuller's term. And then also to re-emphasize your emphasis on moving away from production as an end in itself. I think that here, Tani's work on basically Marxist political philosophy points in the direction that what is the end in itself is exchange. So production is an important means, of course, but that means is towards exchange. And I think that you put that on the level of human self-expression. And I think, of course, human self-expression is here in exchange with others. And so, again, that points towards a more capitalist identity. We have to be, quote unquote, productive. But the reason why we're being, quote unquote, productive is to move towards, I think, socialist spaces of exchange. And then the question becomes, and this is the mega philosophical question for me, is what is the relationship between lack and excess? And here I would point it in the direction of what you were talking about festivals as an expression of excess in itself and a celebration of excess. My main question is, for these festivals which come and go, like they pop up and pop down, are these expressions of excess, are these celebrations of excess a symptom of the lack that we feel in capitalism? And can we bring together lack and excess and understand what I think would be the nature of subjectivity? The nature of subjectivity itself, I think, is a weird oscillation between lack and excess. And how does lack and excess get expressed in capitalism? And specifically, how does lack and excess get expressed in late capitalism? And then what are the challenges that we would face effectively in socialism on the level of lack and excess? And how would they be expressed? And how can we create celebrations of excess that also have a longer term mediation and a deeper connection to the lacks that we all feel? So those would be some of my sort of points. I'm not sure if there are points of connection there, but that's where I am.
Yeah, obviously living here in Santa Fe, I feel a rather poignant or acute sense of intergenerational conflict, right? It's obvious, it's visible that the heat islands are in the parts of town where people are on average younger and have less money and so on. And that the part of Santa Fe that gets advertised to the rest of the world with lots of foliage and running water is somewhere where people don't actually come down out of their castles. And a lot of my thinking is informed by what it means to be a parent in a city that is as polarized as this one. But I don't want to engage in cyclical revolutionary thinking. That seems really short-sighted to me. I don't like Occupy in as much as it defined a 99% against a 1%. I see a planetary problem as requiring a planetary identity. I see Kate Rayworth's donut economics as being, a system that recognizes that there is ultimately no such thing as waste, that there is ultimately no absolute other. And so I am still really preoccupied with this question of, rather than just like waiting for the tree to fall and release its stored carbon back into the soil, this question of, again, like you said, exchange of like, how can we do a better job of regenerating the soil slash regenerating intergenerational relationships without just expecting that we're next in line to amass and consolidate. And like, how can we get nutrient cycling between the institutions that exist? Like, how can we do a better job, even if we have to do this work out of the model, even if we have to act as like fugitives and work in the shadows and in the lacunae and engage in this sort of paradoxical in the system but not of the system kind of way. Is there a way that we can still actually recruit the people and organizations that we may never be able to convince that any of this matters into this kind of work? Like, we don't have time to make the argument, but we have ways of skimming that excess. I mean, I think you
I
understand what
mean,
I'm
I
saying.
think that I have two things that I want to say here. First, I want to offer the metaphor of vultures, roosters, and owls. And the vulture, and this is all inspired from metaphors from philosophy, but the vulture is basically the figure of circling the dead carcass, right? So this is the form of subjectivity that's waiting for the old system to die, right? The vulture. The rooster is inspired by French revolutionary politics, which is trying to change the system in a revolutionary sense, right? And I think you said on both angles that you don't want to be waiting around for the old system to die, and you don't want to do this revolutionary change like 99% versus the 1% Occupy Wall Street style of consciousness. And here I take the position of the owl, which is basically paying attention, not thinking about the future too much as in itself, even though you're future oriented in the present moment, but working with the cracks of the present moment and being diligent, patient, and trying to form these cracks in such a way as that you can make local change, which can have powerful ripple effects within the network. And you don't know, because the thing is that the network could even be better than we think it could be, right? Like it could, like I've had that experience so many times that when you focus on the cracks of the present moment, what ends up happening is that something can emerge that's even better than you thought. So I think if we stay with that patience, we cultivate that subjectivity that is almost beyond death in some deep ethical sense, and we're willing to work with the cracks that people use money to escape, that's crucial. That people use money to escape looking at the cracks of the present moment because they can use money to get rid of it. But if we're the type of subjectivity, that's the true socialist subjectivity that's willing. And I think that who knows this better than anyone? Parents know this better than anyone because parents can't get away from the cracks. You've got to work with the cracks. You're a parent. You can't even, I guess there are some, if you're super rich, you can hire nannies to take care of your kids and stuff like that. But like actual parents who are working with kids, you know what the crack is. You know what patience is. To be a parent, that takes enormous patience. You have to be an owl. You can't be a vulture or a rooster. So I think that's one thing. The second thing I want to say, and this is, I'm taking this from a subtitle of a presentation that Quinn Wheelahan at the upcoming Philosophy Portal conference will be presenting on, which is moving from crisis to contradiction. I know we've got a lot of talk about the meta crisis, but the meta crisis is also subjectively, existentially overwhelming. To focus on the cracks is to focus on the contradictions of your local moment. Focus on the cracks, the contradictions of your local moment. And if you handle them step by step, small step by small step, I think towards this network that could be a more robust socialist hub where we don't even need these investors, where we don't even need people to come along and give us whatever, a couple $100,000 to do a project, because our robust socialist hubs already have the infrastructure in place, which will make the creative projects that we want to do without having to compromise with people who want to pull us like we're dummies with a marionette string. I think this is, at least again, the way I'm orienting myself.
Last thing I want to ask you is again about working with the cracks. I like this a lot. I think I've thought about what it means to lean into something we've been talking about this whole time, which is that the exercise of agency depends on and often occludes all of the ways in which we, as free willed, choosing beings, make our choices within constraints that are given to us, that the body is predominantly automatic, that in order to decide what you want to do with your life, you are not allocating attention to sitting there willing your heart to beat and your lungs to breathe in every moment. Also, the relationship between, if we think about prompting AI, plenty of people have written about the similarity between prompting and the invocation of mythical entities like genies or demons or whatever, and how the surprise is always in the lack of specification, the gaps in the models, the line of code that you neglected, you weren't able to see as crucial until after the fact. So, yeah, I would just, this is more of a generic thing, but I would love for you to riff on this in particular as it might ground in any kind of practical advice for people who are in the process of actualizing themselves within, and in fact, because of systems that radically curtail the scope and possibility of individual choice. How do you tangle with the contradiction of living in a world that is, in some sense, a trace fossil of other people's decisions or other entities' decisions, and yet enact your own decision making in that world, knowing that you can never really knowing that informed consent is something that is not something that can ever really be like practiced in its absolute.
All right. So what I'm going to say here, just going to center around free will. I'm going to try and make it simple, which is I think we have to stay with the gap or the crack in being. Stay with it. Don't try to cover it over. Don't try to paper it over. Religions have tried to paper it over. Capitalism has tried to paper it over. But both of the papering over of the gap or the crack in being is where you find self-actualization. You actualize yourself in the gap or the crack in being. And I think that's true epistemologically and ontologically. And I think that you find what I mean epistemologically is you find your future project in fidelity to the gap or crack in being because you're actually serving the reel of history. You can only find your future project if you're staying with what's missing, if you're staying with what's lacking, and you develop that. Every beginning starts with a lack. Every beginning starts with something missing. And you stay with that, there's a certain pain in that. But if you stay with that, I think that's where there's a real generative project can emerge. And I think it's ontologically true. If there was no gap or crack in being, humans wouldn't be born. We come out of a gap. We're ontologically coming out of this. So it's actually ontologically our origin as well. So I think this is deeply true on both levels. And I think you could ask, staying with this gap, staying with this crack, this is also the guarantee to be non-deterministic. This is also the guarantee to be non-computational. Why? Because what is the gap or the crack? I think it's just our freedom. And I think it's there that we have the space to overcome any of these fantasies of AI as some sort of apocalyptic end of the human being. I think AI is going to computationally or deterministically transform the world, but it's not going to cover over this gap. It's yet another, if we have religion covering over the gap or the crack, if we have capitalism covering over the gap or the crack, if we have technology trying to cover over the gap or the crack, I think that the gift that we have at this moment is that we can discover on a deeper level what is the nature of subjectivity. And I think that's what has motivated the history of modern philosophy. I think it's motivated a lot of the history of psychoanalysis. And I think it should be motivating us when we're building these future networks to be really interested and intrigued about what does it mean today to be free. And I'll just stop there.
Cool. Who else do you think we ought to fold into this series? Somebody who is either really standing in their role as an elder. We ought to get on record while we still can, or underappreciated and deserves a bit more of a platform.
I'm going to say someone who's a little bit, I think, off the radar of people in maybe your side of the network, which is someone I've been collaborating with for 2 or 3 years now and who I see as an elder for myself and building in a direction that I think is absolutely vital for the future. I don't know if you know Peter Rollins, but Peter Rollins is developing what he calls the Church of the Contradiction. And he's also developing a theology that he calls pyrotheology. And he's also going to be teaching in the next Philosophy Portal course on Christian atheism. I think that he is developing what the future of Christianity in the West needs. And so I think that would be a perfect person to bring on to maybe inject some theological reflection on these topics.
Awesome. Thanks so much for riffing today.
On the Loop.
Thanks again for listening. This work is made possible by donations from O'Shaughnessy Ventures, Cosmos Institute, Imaginal Seeds, BitTensor, and listeners like you. Explore my extensive archives at humansontheloop.com, and feel free to email humansontheloop@proton.me with your questions or invitations. Over the next weeks, we'll continue to knit a noetic polity with people like culture critic Rena Nicolai of Incognita, techno shaman George Poor of Future How, author and game designer Chaim Gingold on his book Building SimCity, former DeepMind researcher Larry Molstein of Technological Love, and AI alignment researcher Evan Miyazono of Atlas Computing. And many more! So be sure to whitelist your inbox and turn on your YouTube notifications. Until then, take care, and remember, attention is our greatest natural resource.